Evenings in the earliest American homes arrived with a kind of quiet ceremony. They did not fall all at once. They eased their way across the land, like a soft cloth being drawn gently over the sky. The day would linger for a while, holding on to its color as if unwilling to leave. The golden edge of sunlight would stretch itself thin along the tree line, spilling faint ribbons of warmth that slowly faded into a cool, gentle blue. It was in this slow turning of light that families began to close the rhythm of their day. Inside small colonial homes, the air grew cooler and still. The last of the day's work, the careful tying of tools, the sweeping of dust and straw from the threshold, the pulling of shutters against the evening breeze was done without hurry. These homes were humble but sturdy, built from wood that carried the smell of rain, soil, and time. The scent of the hearth, a mix of smoke, charred wood, and a lingering trace of the last meal clung gently to the beams. There was a familiarity to it, a quiet reassurance that this night would be like the night before, and the night before that, safe, calm, known. Children, often weary from tending gardens, gathering firewood, or helping with younger siblings, drifted naturally toward the heart of the home. The hearth glowed with its deep embers, and the steady sound of fire shifting against iron logs brought a sense of peace that words could never quite capture. Mothers folded cloth or stirred a final pot of warm broth. Fathers returned from checking gates, barns, and coops, the soft crunch of boots against dirt marking their steps as they approached the door. Each movement felt like a quiet ritual, practiced not out of obligation, but out of the steady rhythm of living close to the land. And then came the candles. From a shelf, a box, or sometimes a narrow cupboard, the beeswax candles were brought out like small treasures. They were smooth, pale yellow, almost golden in certain light, and faintly sweet. They smelled of summer flowers, of warm air filled with the hum of bees. Each one had been made by hand, a careful process that turned the work of insects into the soft, steady light that would guide a family through the night. They were not to be wasted. Lighting one carried a small weight of decision. How long would it burn? How many rooms should glow? What work, if any, should still be done by its light? A taper, touched carefully to the hearth, brought the first flame. It flickered uncertainly for a heartbeat, then steadied, its glow warm and rich. Shadows stretched and shifted across the rough walls, climbing high, sliding low, breathing with the movement of the small fire. Each candle seemed to soften the night rather than fight it. The darkness was never fully pushed away. It hovered just beyond the golden ring, a reminder of the vast quiet that waited outside. Families often gathered around a single table. Its surface carried years of used knots in the wood polished smooth where hands rested, scratches and grooves left by knives, ink, and the small accidents of daily life. Children leaned against one another, sometimes against a parent's arm. Older ones might whittle a small toy or shape a piece of cloth into something useful. Some evenings were filled with low conversation. Others carried long stretches of silence, broken only by the soft sounds of fire and the faint hiss of melting wax. There was no urgency to fill the air. Quiet was not something to escape. It was something to rest inside. Outside, the night deepened. A breeze moved through the trees, carrying with it the cool smell of damp leaves and faraway soil. In the stables or pens, animals settled, their quiet shifting a gentle background to human stillness. Occasionally, a lone dog might bark at something unseen, or a horse might shift its weight, the dull thud of hoof against ground carrying faintly to the home. Beyond that lay the vastness of a world without engines, without electricity, without the constant hum of modernity, a world where silence itself was a living presence, large and soft and endless. Within the home, the light pooled gently, illuminating faces, hands, and the humble furniture that made up a family's entire world. There was safety here, not in walls or locks, but in the familiar cadence of life shared with those who belonged to each other. The beeswax candles burned slowly, patiently, as if aware that their task was not merely to give light, but to hold a space of peace. And so the evening passed in its unhurried way, a mother's hand smoothing a child's hair, a father leaning back with quiet eyes, a sibling softly humming, perhaps a small story whispered before bed. The glow of the candles wrapped it all in a gentle haze, where time seemed to slow, where night did not threaten, but simply invited the household to drift steadily toward rest. It was a world of soft edges, muted sounds, and human warmth, the rhythm, not lost, but merely quieted by sleep, ready to rise again with the morning light. Night had fully arrived now. It lay across the land like a heavy blanket, thick and endless, a sky of deep velvet stitched with quiet stars. There were no lamps along the roads, no glow from distant cities, no mechanical hum rising from hidden places, only the breathing of the earth itself, soft winds shifting the tops of trees, the low rustle of grasses brushing against one another, the occasional distant call of an owl slipping through the dark. In small colonial homes, this vast quiet was not feared. It was welcomed. The world at night was neither empty nor cold. It was simply slower, deeper, a place where thoughts could stretch without boundary. And inside the home, a handful of candles softened its reach, drawing the edge of darkness into a gentle curve rather than a sharp divide. Beeswax candles were prized above tallow. Their flames burned cleaner, their scent softer, their light steadier. The glow they gave off was not harsh. It had a warmth to it, a golden hue that kissed the wood of the walls and made the shadows dance like slow water. One could watch the flame for minutes at a time and feel no urgency to look away. It moved with a calm rhythm, bending and straightening, fluttering only when a small draft wandered by, never hurried, never wild. Some families placed their candles in simple iron holders, a looped handle at the base for carrying between rooms. Others used small dishes of clay, or carved wooden stands, or even a humble saucer, if that was what was at hand. The purpose was not decoration, but usefulness. Yet in their simplicity there was a kind of quiet beauty. The way the wax pooled slowly around the wick, cooling at the edges, forming tiny ridges and smooth lakes that shifted with each hour of burning, seemed like its own quiet art. The candles were not always for reading or work. Often they were simply there to hold the night gently at bay. A single candle on the hearth table might burn while a mother rocked an infant. Another, placed near a shelf of jars and herbs, gave just enough light for a father to select what was needed for a soothing tea. Sometimes a few candles were arranged near the window, not for anyone inside, but to offer a soft signal of life and safety to a neighbor returning late along a quiet path. Light was both comfort and communication, a wordless message that all was well. Conversations at night were rarely hurried. Words came slowly, like stepping stones placed carefully across a stream. Some nights there was talk of weather, the stubborn rain, the welcome sun, the frost that lingered longer than expected. Other nights carried quiet planning, which crops to tend, which repairs could wait, which needed doing before morning. And sometimes there were no plans, only stories. Tales not of kings or battles, but of rivers and hills, of seasons past, of a deer seen at the edge of the woods, of a fox that stole eggs from the coop. Small things, gentle things, carried across time with the same patience as the flame that lit the telling. Children, their faces soft with drowsiness, listened without interrupting. The warmth of the hearth and the steady pulse of candlelight made even small sounds, the creak of a chair, the shifting of embers, the faint sigh of a settling beam, feel like part of the night's music. There was no rush to sleep, no clock to beat, no alarm waiting to tear the morning open. Rest came like a slow tide, touching ankles, then knees, then the whole body, until even the last words were spoken softly, as if not to disturb the calm that had filled the room. Outside, the night pressed gently against the shutters. If a cloud passed over the moon, the room did not notice. The candles kept their quiet vigil. Wax slid slowly, almost invisibly, down their sides. Wicks shortened. The smell of honey and smoke wove together in the still air. Hours did not matter. Only the shared presence did. The fact that here, in this little pocket of light, life was whole, and the night could wait. Sometimes, before sleep, someone would tend to the candles with care. A father might pinch a wick just enough to shorten its flame, saving wax for the next evening. A mother might move a nearly spent candle closer to the wall, where its small glow would still be enough to guide anyone who rose during the night. Even these acts were slow, deliberate, respectful. Nothing about these nights was careless, and yet nothing about them was strict. They were simply gentle, a way of living with light that understood its value, not in brightness, but in calm. And so the rooms grew still again. A chair creaked softly as its occupant leaned back. A spoon rested at last against a wooden bowl. Eyes grew heavy, not from exhaustion, but from ease. The candles burned on, steady companions in the dark, soft keepers of peace, carrying the family gently through the night's wide silence, toward the soft promise of dawn. The hours between supper and sleep were not measured by clocks. Time in those quiet homes was felt more than counted, carried along by the slow burn of beeswax and the gentle fading of voices. The day's work had softened into rest. Hands once busy with plows or pots now lay loosely in laps, warm from the hearth and fragrant from the evening meal. In many households, the evening began with small rituals. A child might be sent to fetch the candles from a shelf or a chest, careful to carry them upright so the wax did not chip or crack. The mother might trim the wicks with a small pair of scissors kept only for that purpose. The faint snip, a soft punctuation in the gentle quiet. The father might test the shutters, feeling for the edge of a draft, ensuring that the night air, sharp and damp, did not creep too boldly into the warm stillness inside. When the candles were lit, one after another, their glow stretched across the rough wooden walls like an unfolding fabric of light. Corners that moments earlier had been deep with shadow now softened into quiet shapes. The edges of chairs, the smooth surface of a well-used table, the grain of the wood on the floorboards, all gained a gentle depth, a kind of hushed dignity. There was no glare, no sudden brightness. The world was still dim, but in a way that soothed rather than strained the eyes. Sometimes neighbors visited. They came not with great announcements or urgent matters, but simply to share the company of another household. A knock at the door was often followed by the shuffle of boots, the murmur of greetings, the polite removal of hats. The candles greeted these guests as if they, too, were part of the welcome, their flames bending slightly when the door opened to the cool night air. The conversation during these visits rarely rose above a murmur. Laughter came, yes, but gently, like bubbles rising in calm water. A story might be told of a horse that wandered too far into the meadow, or of a new calf born stronger than expected, or of a sudden rain that spared a field just in time. These were not tales of drama, but of belonging threads in the quiet tapestry of a shared life, stitched in the soft light of beeswax. In homes with children, the candlelit evenings often became lessons. A father might teach a child how to carve a simple tool, guiding small hands with large, steady ones, the shadow of their fingers stretching across the table like patient teachers. A mother might show her daughter how to mend a sleeve, the needle glinting briefly in the candlelight with each careful stitch. The knowledge passed along in those hours was as steady and practical as the candles themselves, illuminating the path forward one soft evening at a time. Some families used that time for reading, though books were precious and not every home owned them. The Bible was common, a tether of faith and habit, often read aloud and slow, even tones that matched the rhythm of the night. Sometimes there were almanacs or collections of sermons, sometimes a single worn volume of poetry or essays, shared again and again until its words became as familiar as family names. Reading by candlelight was not effortless. The eyes tired sooner than they would in daylight. But in that mild struggle, there was also a kind of quiet joy. The pleasure of knowledge pulled gently from the shadows. The soundscape of such nights was delicate and sparse. A log in the fireplace would shift with a soft sigh. Somewhere, a board in the floor might creak, as if remembering a footstep from earlier in the day. Outside, the wind might gather itself into a slow, thoughtful push against the side of the house, rattling a shutter just enough to make a soft clatter, then retreating again into the waiting trees. Sometimes, if all else was still, the faint hiss of the candle's own burning could be heard, wax surrendering to heat, wick feeding a patient, hungry flame. The longer the night went on, the slower everything became. Sentences grew shorter, pauses longer. A child's head might drift against a parent's shoulder, eyes heavy, breath deepening. Tasks that seemed important at sundown lost their urgency. Even the candlelight seemed to respond, its soft gold flicker becoming less a tool and more a companion, as if it, too, was content to do nothing more than keep the darkness tender and far away. Eventually, one by one, the candles were extinguished. Some were blown out in gentle puffs, the smoke curling briefly upward before disappearing. Others were snuffed with a small iron cap, the flame disappearing in silence, leaving only the faint scent of warm wax in the cool air. Each darkened flame marked the soft closing of a chapter. A conversation ended, a story paused, a child carried off to bed, and then, as the last wick surrendered its light, the home gave itself back to the night, not to emptiness, but to rest. The darkness outside and the darkness within met like two halves of a whole, quiet, calm, unbroken. In that gentle union, families slept, trusting that the same hands that had tended their candles would tend the morning. That light would come again, not hurried, not forced, but in its own quiet, steady way. By the time the last stretch of the evening had arrived, the house had already softened into a hush that felt like it belonged not only to the family inside but also to the world beyond. The sound of the night outside, faint though it was, entered like a familiar friend through cracks in window frames, through loose boards and narrow gaps that no amount of care could completely seal. There was no need to seal it out. The night did not threaten. It simply breathed. It breathed through the leaves, through the grass, through the cool dirt roads and the wooden fences that marked one piece of land from the next. Inside, the candles continued their steady labor, carrying light not with urgency but with patience. Their flames leaned ever so slightly with the movement of air, bending as if bowing to the slow rhythm of the evening. In that gentle glow, every small thing in the home carried a kind of quiet beauty, the rough edge of a chair carved by hand, the soft unevenness of a woven rug, the faint lines in a wooden table that told of years of meals, prayers, and laughter. Nothing was polished to shine. Nothing needed to be. In some homes, the final hours of the night were spent in reflection. The family might sit together, not speaking, simply existing in the warm silence. The mother might rest her hands, roughened from work, yet graceful in stillness, on the table. The father might stare quietly into the gentle sway of the flame, his thoughts as slow and steady as the burn of the wick. Children sometimes listened not to stories but to the sound of nothing, the sound of a house alive only in its soft creaks, its breathing hearth, and the heartbeat of its inhabitants, measured not in words but in quiet presence. Sometimes a prayer would arise, not hurried, not ornate, but humble, steady, like the day itself. A whispered thanks for safe returns from the fields, for warm bread that cooled slowly on wooden boards, for neighbors who lent hands, for rain that arrived when it was most needed, for the soft mercy of an uneventful day. Such prayers carried no weight of demand, only the gentle warmth of gratitude, an offering given to the night as naturally as a candle gives light to the dark. Outside, the quiet world stretched vast and calm. Stars pierced the darkness, patient in their cold glow, while somewhere far away a creek moved unseen, its water folding over smooth stones with a sound softer than speech. An owl might call, its voice drifting through the trees like a question no one needed to answer. A distant dog barked once and then fell silent again, as if it, too, understood that this was not a night for noise, but for rest. And then, when even the weight of sitting upright began to feel unnecessary, the family rose, each by habit knowing what to do next without direction. Candles were checked one by one. Those still tall were saved for the next night, snuffed gently to preserve their wax. Those that had burned low were allowed to finish, their final flickers welcomed as the natural conclusion of their service. The last moments of flame often drew eyes to them, as if some part of the human heart wanted to linger on the quiet companionship of light a little longer. In those final flickers lay a story, not of greatness or grandeur, but of simple endurance. The candle had done its work. It had turned solid wax into warmth, shadow into safety, silence into presence. It had asked for nothing but the wick it carried and the breath of those who lit it. And in return, it gave not only light but a rhythm, a soft, reliable measure by which the day wound itself gently toward sleep. The last puff of smoke curled upward, carrying the faint scent of beeswax into the night-cooled air. For a moment the room felt empty, the darkness deep, but soon eyes adjusted, and the moon's pale hand reached through windows, filling the quiet with its own version of light, colder, softer, not a companion but a witness. Beds were taken without hurry, quilts drawn, straw mattresses shifting with the familiar sound of settling weight. The children often fell asleep first, their breathing steady, faces soft in repose. Small bodies curled like seedlings safe beneath the soil. The adults lingered a moment longer, not to speak, but simply to hold stillness the way one holds a fragile cup, aware of its worth, unwilling to let it spill too soon. And as sleep finally claimed the household, the world outside continued in its slow, unbothered way. The candles had gone dark, but the rhythm they had set lingered in the breath of each sleeper, in the heartbeat of a house that no longer worked but rested, in the soft promise that tomorrow would come with light again, gentle, unhurried, familiar, and kind. There was a quiet weight to the air of an early American library, not heavy, not oppressive, but present, like a woolen blanket drawn gently across the shoulders on a cool evening. The walls were made of timber, sometimes roughly hewn, sometimes polished smooth by years of use, and they held in the warmth of the day, just long enough for the night's chill to creep in slowly, politely, as if asking permission. Shelves, simple and sturdy, held books that were few in number by the standards of later centuries. Yet each felt as though it carried entire worlds inside. Candles burned, not for decoration, but for survival of thought. Without their steady flames, the words would remain locked in shadow, unreachable, silent. And so they stood, tall and thin, sometimes beeswax, sometimes tallow, sometimes a careful blend, their light dancing across wooden tables and polished brass holders, catching the edges of pages and making the ink shimmer faintly like old stars. People came in from the cold or from long days of labor, some with hands rough from rope and soil, others with ink already smudged into their fingers. Yet in this space they shared the same gentle posture, heads bowed not from fatigue but from reverence. Boots made of leather scuffed softly against the floorboards, a faint thud softened by rugs woven with care, and coats were hung on pegs by the door with a kind of quiet ritual, as though the outside world, the markets, the fields, the wind and the rain, had to be left respectfully behind before stepping fully into the hush of learning. There was no librarian in the modern sense, not always. Sometimes a town elder, sometimes a traveling scholar, sometimes just a trusted neighbor with the keys and a fondness for reading. Books were precious, and borrowing them meant a kind of personal promise to treat the pages as gently as one would cradle a newborn. They were expensive to print, difficult to obtain, and often shared among households, passing from hand to hand like small portable treasures. Families might gather here in the evening, a father with two sons, a mother with her daughter, all leaning slightly toward the same table, reading not in silence but in soft, patient murmurs. A passage would be read aloud, then paused over, then discussed in voices hardly louder than the crackle of the small fire in the corner stove. Not every word was understood, not every idea was fully grasped, but the rhythm of it, the sharing, the learning, the simple act of turning one more page, felt like a slow weaving of the community's mind. The air itself carried scents that only existed in such places, a trace of wax, faintly sweet, the deep, dry aroma of leather bindings warmed by flame, the earthy musk of paper born of rags and pulp, touched by dozens of careful hands. Occasionally the faintest hint of smoke, when a candle flickered to near its wick, curling upward in a thread that drifted toward the beams overhead, before disappearing like a sigh. Time moved differently here. Outside, the town might be closing shutters, blowing out lanterns, preparing for the steady rhythm of sleep. Dogs might bark briefly in the distance. A cart might creak its way home over packed dirt roads. But inside the library, each moment felt like it lingered, stretching itself thin, not because it resisted the future, but because it wished to savor the now. A boy, barely 12, might discover a book about distant lands, descriptions of cities so vast they sounded like dreams, and his eyes would widen, his breath slow, his body leaning forward as though trying to fall into the page itself. An older man, gray in the beard and heavy in the shoulders, might find comfort in scripture or in the tales of philosophers whose words felt both strange and familiar, carrying truths shaped in other worlds, yet somehow suited to this one. No one rushed, even when the candles grew low, even when the wax pulled thick around their bases. There was no sudden call to leave. The dimming of the light was less an alarm than a soft reminder that night was advancing, that beds waited, that tomorrow held its own labors. But for a little while longer, people stayed, letting the glow cradle their eyes, letting the weight of words settle gently across their minds like falling snow. Sometimes, when the door opened again, letting in a gust of chill, those inside would glance up, not startled, but aware a new presence, a new listener, a new thread in the quiet fabric of the evening. A nod was enough for greeting. No need for chatter. The room itself carried all the welcome anyone required. And when finally the last page was turned, the final word read aloud, the candles carefully pinched, the doors closed with a soft wooden sigh, the night would reclaim the streets, the stars would resume their patient watch, and the world outside would once again become the quiet, breathing darkness from which this small island of thought had briefly risen. There was a rhythm to the evenings in those early towns, a pulse almost too gentle to notice, like the slow rocking of a chair or the steady breathing of a child asleep nearby. In the libraries, though, some were no more than a single room of a meeting hall or the back chamber of a merchant's house, that rhythm carried people through the quiet hours. They came not in great numbers, but enough to fill the space with a soft, human warmth, the kind that lives between words, between heartbeats, between the sound of a candle's faint hiss when its flame leans into the wax. Tables were never grand. They were square or rectangular, built by local carpenters, sometimes uneven at the legs, always sturdy enough to bear the weight of books and elbows, folded arms and drifting thoughts. The wood carried marks of use, faint scratches from quills, a ring where a cup of cider once stood too long, a thin line darkened by an old spill. These were not flaws. They were memories held in grain, a quiet record of evenings passed in patient learning. Outside, the wind might brush gently against the shutters, a reminder of the world's restlessness. The sound of wagon wheels fading into the distance, a lone horse's hooves upon the packed dirt, a neighbor's dog calling out into the night. All of it served not as a distraction, but as a lullaby of the familiar. It made the warmth of the candlelight feel more precious, more protective, a circle of soft gold drawn against the dark. The books themselves were an uneven collection, gathered over years, sometimes gifted, sometimes purchased with coins, saved patiently over many months. There were volumes of scripture, of law, of philosophy, of farming, of navigation. There were journals from distant travelers, the words of men and women who had walked streets no one in this town had ever seen, describing mountains too high to imagine, rivers wide as dreams. For those who read them, the pages offered both escape and anchor, a glimpse of worlds beyond, and a quiet reassurance that their own lives, too, held meaning. Often a single person would read aloud while others listened, eyes closed, leaning slightly toward the sound, letting the voice become a kind of soft music. The words flowed not quickly, but with care. Each sentence, a slow turn of the wheel that moved thought forward like a boat across calm water. A passage might spark a question, not urgent, not argumentative, but curious, like someone gently tapping at a door. And so a conversation would begin, low, patient, turning over ideas like smooth stones in one's hand. Each angle examined, not for judgment, but for the quiet joy of seeing something from more than one side. Children were sometimes brought along, especially in winter when nights were long and fires at home already well tended. They would sit close to parents, small heads resting against larger shoulders, eyes half-lidded, the murmur of reading and soft discussion blending with the gentle fatigue of the day. Some would drift to sleep, their dreams perhaps carrying the echo of far-off lands described only an hour before. Others would listen with a kind of quiet awe, the slow planting of seeds that would bloom much later, in ways no one yet could name. The candles would be trimmed when they guttered, the wicks pinched and straightened with careful fingers, the small tools for tending flame as necessary here as ink and paper. Wax would pool and harden, to be scraped away later, leaving behind small pale rings on wooden surfaces, like faded moons in miniature. In these circles of light, the boundaries of the world seemed simple. Here, knowledge glowed. Beyond, the dark waited with patient silence. Sometimes, a visitor from another town would stop in, carrying with them a single book wrapped carefully in cloth, a volume their own library had finished with, or could temporarily spare. It was an event, though never treated as spectacle. A few gentle smiles, a quiet thank you, perhaps a brief description of the book's contents, and then it would join the others on the shelf. its story now waiting for the right night, the right reader, the right quiet moment to bring it fully alive again. In these rooms, time was not measured in hours, but in candles. A full one might last through several chapters, a short one, only a few pages. When at last the flames grew low and shadows stretched across the shelves like fingers reaching for the last scraps of light, the evening would draw itself gently to a close. There was no sharp command, no bell, no warning, just a shared understanding. It was enough for now. Chairs would slide softly against the floor, garments gathered, boots pulled back on with muted thuds. The door, when opened, allowed in a breath of night air, crisp, earthy, carrying the smell of soil, of water, of the distant fields now lying under stars. And each person, stepping out, carried something intangible but weighty, a quiet satisfaction, a new thought, a small widening of the inner world, all wrapped in the warmth of candlelight that seemed to linger behind the eyes even after it was gone. And so the library returned to stillness, the shelves standing silently in the dark, the books at rest once again, waiting with the patience only paper and ink can hold, knowing that soon enough another night would come, another candle would be lit, and another soul would sit quietly at a table, seeking the gentle company of words. Silence is not the absence of sound, but rather a texture, a gentle fabric woven from all the soft noises a night can hold. In those early libraries, silence was alive. It breathed in the faint creak of wooden shelves, in the tender sighs of chairs adjusting under the slow weight of a shifting reader, in the almost imperceptible crackle of wax as a candle leaned into its own warmth. It was a quiet that did not demand stillness. It invited it, offered it as a kind of gift. People often came in pairs or small groups, sometimes families, sometimes friends, sometimes strangers who over time grew familiar in that space. They did not come for spectacle, nor for conversation as the main event. They came for the way words could live differently in the company of others, how a paragraph felt deeper when someone else sat near enough to share the same circle of light. They might not speak for an hour, yet they shared something, a bond formed not in action but in quiet presence. One might sit near the shelves, tracing titles with a gentle finger, choosing slowly, as if each book were a small door that opened to a different room of the imagination. Another might already be lost in a chapter, their face softened, eyes moving not urgently but steadily, like someone watching a slow river. A child might lean their head against a parent's arm, eyelids heavy, listening without trying to understand every word, only feeling the weight of them, like rain falling softly on a roof. The light of candles worked a kind of magic. It was never harsh, never hurried. It softened the edges of the room, blurred the lines of tables and shelves, left corners in shadow where imagination could rest. In that glow, the letters on a page seemed to carry more than just meaning. They carried warmth, the quiet assurance that even in a world of labor and weather, of harvests and trade, there was a place where thought could sit untroubled. Sometimes a whisper would rise, a low voice reading a single sentence aloud, then falling back into stillness. A hand might reach across the table to tap lightly on a word, a shared smile between readers who found delight in the same turn of phrase. Occasionally a quiet laugh would slip through, not sharp or loud, but soft, like the echo of a memory one is glad to share. Then, once again, the silence would settle, not broken, merely reshaped, like a blanket adjusted around tired shoulders. The air carried a mixture of scents, old paper, faint ink, candle wax, wood warmed by flame, and occasionally the trace of smoke from a hearth nearby. These smells did not compete. They layered gently, each a reminder of time, of labor, of care. There was no rush to replace a fading candle or to fetch another log for the fire. The rhythm of the place was governed not by clocks, but by comfort. Outside, the night deepened. Stars turned slowly overhead, invisible from inside but present nonetheless, like a quiet heartbeat of the sky. The world beyond the library grew cooler, more still, the bustle of day entirely dissolved. The few travelers who passed along the dirt road likely noticed the faint squares of light in the building, a sign that thought and warmth remained alive while the rest of the town slept. Sometimes, a lone reader would linger after the others had gone, reluctant to leave the safe harbor of shared quiet. The caretaker of the books, often just a trusted neighbor, not an official in any formal sense, would allow it without comment. There was no rule against one more page, one more slow return to a favorite passage. When at last the book was closed, the weight of it felt different, not heavy, but full, like carrying a piece of night sky inside one's chest. And as the door opened, letting in a soft breath of cool air, the departing reader stepped into a world that felt, for a moment, changed. Not because the town itself was different, the streets were the same, the trees stood where they always had, but because the heart inside carried a new rhythm, a slower, steadier beat, like the quiet ticking of a clock that no longer needed to be watched. The books remained behind, waiting in the hush, their spines reflecting faint candlelight before darkness reclaimed the room. They did not hurry, they never did. They would be there tomorrow, and the day after, patient as the turning of the earth, ready for another night of shared silence, another round of thoughts set free in gentle company. As the night leaned into its deepest hours, the little library seemed to exhale. The candles stood shorter now, their wax pooled and hardened in delicate shapes that looked almost like small rivers frozen mid-current. The flames no longer danced as brightly, they moved in slow, steady breaths, like an old friend leaning back in a chair, tired yet content. The readers who remained sat as if time had paused for them, each breath drawn softly, each page turned with reverence, as though to disturb the silence would be to break a fragile, beautiful spell. There were moments in that quiet when the sound of a single page turning could feel like a ripple across a lake. It carried just far enough to remind everyone they were together, not isolated, not alone, but sharing something tender, something rare. No one hurried to finish. The idea of an ending felt foreign here, even as eyes grew heavy, as words blurred into the gentle hum of thought and half-dream. No one wished for closure. They wished only for the night to hold a little longer. The room was dimmer now, shadows stretching wider, touching one another across the floor. In the far corner, a pair of readers leaned close, their heads bowed toward the same open book, not speaking, just breathing the same quiet air, letting meaning bloom between them without need for words. Across the room, a man rested his forehead lightly against his hand, eyes half closed, still reading, though perhaps more through memory than through sight. Beside him, a young woman traced the edges of a page with her finger, not yet turning it, just feeling the faint texture of ink pressed into paper, as if she might hold on to the moment by holding on to the paper itself. Outside, a horse shifted in its stall, the soft sound of hooves against wood barely audible through the thick wooden walls. Somewhere down the road, a shutter tapped lightly in the wind, not urgent, not disruptive, just another note in the long song of night. The world beyond was cold, quiet, empty of motion. Yet inside, warmth gathered like a soft tide, surrounding those few who stayed, letting them drift in peace. Eventually, someone would rise, slowly, carefully, reluctant to break the stillness. A chair would slide gently across the wooden floor, the soft scrape barely a whisper. A coat lifted from its peg, a hat taken with a quiet hand. No words of goodbye were needed. A simple nod carried enough meaning. One by one, they departed, not in haste, but like stars fading before dawn, leaving behind not absence, but a memory of light. The caretaker, often the last to leave, would walk the room in silence, touching the edges of tables, adjusting a book left open, trimming the last stubborn wick that still glowed faintly. There was a kind of care in every movement, not duty, but affection. A love not just for books, but for the calm they carried, for the way they allowed a small town to breathe differently, even if only for a few hours each night. When the final candle was pinched dark, the room seemed to hum with what had been shared. The air held a faint warmth, like a memory that hadn't yet faded. The books stood in neat rows, silent but not asleep, waiting patiently, as they always did. The door closed with a gentle click. Outside, the moon still hung over the rooftops, casting soft silver on the dirt roads. On the quiet windows of houses where families slept unaware of the small, sacred hush that had unfolded nearby. The steps of the caretaker were slow, steady, in rhythm with the night itself. There was no need to hurry. The next evening would come soon enough. And when it did, the candles would be lit again, their glow calling gently through the glass, inviting anyone willing to step into a world without noise, without urgency, without the pull of daylight's demands. A world where thoughts wandered softly, where stories breathed not to impress, but simply to exist. A sanctuary of words and warmth, made not grand by size or wealth, but by the quiet devotion of those who sought peace in the turning of a page. Such places never announced their worth with trumpets or banners. They were small, humble, tucked into corners of towns whose names may never be remembered. Yet in them, lives found a different rhythm, hearts a gentler beat, minds a freedom not granted by any law or coin, but by a circle of light, a few quiet voices, and the endless patience of books waiting to be held. As the night gave way, as the stars dimmed before the slow stretch of morning, the memory of those hours lingered like the faint scent of smoke and cool air, a reminder that even in the simplest corners of the young nation, beauty and rest had found their home, tucked softly between covers, carried tenderly in the glow of beeswax candles. When the day ended, when the fields and streets had grown silent, when the cool of evening wrapped gently around the little houses scattered across the land, families gathered where warmth gathered around the fire. It was not only a place to keep out the cold, it was a center, a quiet heart beating softly beneath a wooden roof. The fire crackled, not with urgency, but with patience, each log giving up its heat in slow, steady breaths. Sparks would sometimes rise, not wildly, but like tiny glowing seeds drifting upward, before vanishing into the dim air of the chimney. The sound of burning wood was a sound of safety, a soft reminder that the home itself was alive, that within its walls life carried on quietly, without rush. Armchairs stood near, placed carefully, sometimes mismatched, sometimes worn smooth by years of use. They held more than bodies, they held stories. The weight of a day's labor sank into their cushions, shoulders easing as heat reached stiff fingers and chilled cheeks. A chair placed at just the right angle might catch both warmth and light. A place where a reader could drift from the lines of a book into a gentle doze, without ever meaning to. Children often curled themselves into these chairs as well, feet tucked up, heads resting against the steady rhythm of a parent's breathing. The warmth of the fire, the soft rustle of someone turning a page, the murmur of quiet talk between those two tired for anything but soft words. All of it blended into a hush, so complete that even the wind outside seemed to slow. The room carried scents that comforted: smoke from the hearth, faint sweetness from bread cooling somewhere nearby, wool drying after a wet walk home, the clean smell of pine or oak from fresh-cut logs stacked by the door. None of it competed, everything simply belonged, like layers of memory built into air itself. Sometimes, a grandfather or a grandmother would speak softly, voice low, words slow, weaving not so much a story as a path through familiar memories, a tale of a winter long past, of storms endured, of neighbors who had helped, of small joys found when the world outside had offered little. The firelight played across faces listening, not in sharp contrast but in gentle glow, softening features, catching in eyes that glistened with both reflection and fatigue. No one hurried here. No one needed to. The chairs did not ask for motion, only for presence. They invited stillness, the kind of stillness that deepens instead of empties, the kind that lets a heart settle from the day's demands into the quiet rhythm of simply being. Even those who did not speak felt joined. A father rubbing warmth back into his hands, a mother letting her head rest briefly against the back of her chair, a child half asleep with a blanket across their knees. All were bound together not by words, but by the simple act of sharing warmth, of choosing to remain close while the night moved on outside. Sometimes, the fire would dim, logs collapsing into embers that glowed with a red patience. Still alive, still giving, a quiet hand would reach for another log, set it gently into place, stir the coals just enough to wake a few small flames. The sound, a soft sigh, a shift of glowing ash filled the room, not with noise, but with reassurance. The night could go on. The warmth would last. In those quiet homes, across towns and farmlands, across mountains and valleys, armchairs by the fire were not luxuries. They were small sanctuaries, places where the weight of a growing nation, with all its labor, all its travel, all its noise, simply dissolved for a while, where the body could rest and the mind could drift, not into sleep just yet, but into that calm, half-waking state where time has no edge, and comfort has no measure. The outside world was often harsh, the cold biting, the roads muddy or frozen, the work unending. But here, in the soft glow of firelight, in the gentle embrace of a well-worn chair, life shrank to something tender, something manageable, something almost sacred. And as the hours deepened, as voices quieted and movements slowed, a peace settled over the room like a blanket, warm and light. Not a peace that shouted of triumph or victory, but one that whispered of safety, of belonging, of the simple, perfect comfort of being home. As the years drifted on, homes themselves changed shape, yet the hearth often remained at their center. Walls might be sturdier now, the roofs better at keeping out the rain, but the pull of the fire and the comfort of a chair nearby did not fade. It was a constant, a steady presence in a world that could sometimes feel uncertain. The chairs grew more carefully made over time. Where once a rough bench or a stiff wooden seat had been enough, now there were curved arms, smooth legs, cushions stuffed with wool or horsehair. Fabrics carried soft colors, browns and muted reds, pale blues, creams like quiet morning skies. Nothing loud, nothing meant to dazzle. Everything seemed chosen for rest, for ease, for the gentle sense that one could sit here and let the world slow down for a while. Some chairs bore the marks of years. The polish dulled where hands always rested, the cushions shaped by the weight of familiar bodies returning night after night. The scent of the room, smoke, wood, faint cooking spices, settled into the fibers, and somehow, that too became part of the comfort. It was not cleanliness people sought here, not display, but a kind of worn-in peace. A message whispered in every creak of wood: you are safe, you are home, you can let go now. Outside, the rhythms of America were changing. Towns grew busier, roads linked one settlement to another. Ships carried news, goods, and ideas across oceans. People worked harder, often longer, and the world began to feel wider than the fields and forests of their youth. Yet when they returned home, when the night closed around them, when the weight of travel and labor pressed on their shoulders, there was always a chair, always a fire, always a quiet space where the day could soften into evening, and the evening could stretch gently toward sleep. Children grew up in those chairs, at least for moments. They climbed onto laps, listened to stories about lands they had never seen, felt the vibrations of laughter or the steady beat of a heart beneath them. Some fell asleep mid-sentence, head resting against a chest, carried later to bed while the fire dimmed and the night deepened. Years later, those same children would take their own seats near the same hearth. Now adults themselves, watching their parents grow older, their own hands growing rough from work, their own shoulders bearing new responsibilities, yet always returning to the same quiet glow, the same embrace of chair and fire. The chairs also bore witness to quiet talks, decisions made with no rush, sometimes with no words at all. A mother's look across the room to a father's tired nod, the faintest shift of a child knowing it was time for bed, a visitor leaning forward, voice hushed as though the very flames might listen in. Life unfolded here, in threads too gentle for history books to record, yet strong enough to hold generations together. The soundscape was always soft, always slow. The fire murmured, occasionally a log cracked, a little burst of sparks, sent upward like brief stars fading into night. A chair might creak under a shifting weight, a cup might touch down on a wooden table with a soft, hollow note. A sigh might rise unbidden as someone leaned back and let the warmth soak in. These were not the sounds of drama, but of quiet presence, small proofs that life, in its gentlest form, was happening right there. Outside the windows, the world might be wet with rain or crisp with snow. Winds might scrape along rooftops, branches might tap gently against glass. But within, the fire and the chairs turned the house into a world apart, a refuge where nature's wildness could be watched, respected, even admired from a distance, from safety, from warmth. Even when guests came, the circle around the fire adjusted naturally. More chairs would be brought closer, rearranged without fuss, making room for new stories, for new laughter, for news of births, travels, and weddings. Some nights, music would join the firelight, a fiddle, soft singing, a tune kept low so as not to wake a baby. The glow of the flames would dance across instruments, across smiling faces, across eyes that knew both hardship and joy. Time, in these moments, seemed to stretch rather than pass. Minutes did not march. They drifted, gentle as the smoke curling upward, as steady as the beat of hearts content to be where they were. There was no sense of waste in this slowness. It was rest earned honestly, treasured deeply, never hurried, never regretted. These armchairs, these fires, these quiet gatherings were not loud chapters in the nation's story, but they were the pauses that gave meaning to the work, the journeys, the progress. They were the breaths between words, the spaces where people remembered why they struggled, why they built, why they stayed. And as the night once more grew late, as shadows reached farther, as eyelids grew heavy, the last small duties of the evening were done with care. The fire banked for safety. A final glance at doors and windows. A last soft word exchanged between those awake, just long enough to whisper goodnight. Chairs emptied, but their warmth lingered. A promise that tomorrow evening, and the evening after, and so many evenings still to come, they would be waiting, patient, quiet, steady, like old friends who never ask, only welcome. Morning light would sometimes slip softly through small windows, touching the arm of a chair before anyone else had stirred. It was not a loud intrusion, but a delicate nudge, a whisper of day arriving with no hurry. The house would stretch awake in its own way, a faint sound of floorboards, a kettle slowly coming to life, and perhaps a soft cough from someone rising before the others. But the chairs near the hearth did not move yet. They waited, still warm from the night before, still carrying the shape of evening gatherings within their cushions. As the first person drifted into the room, often a parent or an elder, there was a moment of pause. They might stand their eyes, taking in the quiet house, the chairs in their familiar places, the ashes of the fire glowing faintly, like a heartbeat still at rest. They would add wood carefully, not to wake the house with sharp noise, but to coax the warmth back into its full, steady breath. Soon the faint crackle would return, the first flames stretching upward, and the air itself would sigh, gently giving up the chill of night. Through slow mornings, these chairs became silent hosts to the start of the day. A shawl might be draped across an armrest, a cup held between palms as someone sat alone for a moment, letting thoughts form softly, letting the world beyond the walls wait a little longer. It was a private time, a gentle conversation with warmth itself, with the quiet company of a house not yet filled with voices. By afternoon, the rhythm changed. The day's work would be in motion. Sometimes a child would pause their chores, slipping into one of the chairs to rest for a few minutes, feet barely touching the floor, eyes wandering across the room, imagining things that no one else could see. Perhaps they dreamed of faraway places, or perhaps only of supper to come, or of a story that might be told later when night closed in. The chair held them gently, as it held everyone, never asking, never rushing, simply offering its patient shape, its quiet support. Even in quiet homes, time brought change. Fabrics wore down, colors faded, replaced by whatever cloth could be spared, stitched with care by someone who loved both the chair and the person who used it. Sometimes the arms were patched, the legs tightened, the cushions refilled. These small acts were not only about keeping a seat, they were about keeping a promise, that comfort, that small daily refuge, would not be lost to the wear of time. There were evenings when the chairs gathered more people than usual. A traveler might arrive, weary from the road, carrying news or letters, or simply the dust of distant places. They would be offered a chair near the fire, perhaps a blanket, a cup of something warm. They would lean back, the first tension leaving their shoulders, their hands loosening, their voice dropping into the same calm tone the household had long known. The firelight would flicker across their tired eyes, and for a while, even strangers felt like family. The night hours carried their own tenderness. Children often drifted to sleep in these chairs, curled against a parent's side, a thumb still tucked under their chin, breath even and slow. The parent too might nod off, head tilting back, mouth slightly open, a book slipping closed in their lap. The fire would settle lower, its glow a soft hum of orange and gold, casting shadows that wavered across walls like old, quiet dancers. There were nights with rain, a soft drumming on the roof, a distant roll of thunder, when the sound outside seemed to fold the house tighter, as if wrapping it in an invisible blanket. The armchairs felt heavier then, more anchored, more like small, safe harbors in a restless sea of weather. People would speak less, listen more, to the rain, to the wind, to the shifting sigh of logs in the fire. It was a time not of words but of presence, of simply being together while the world outside rearranged itself in water and wind. Sometimes, in those moments, thoughts would travel backward to parents now gone, to first homes, to the simpler joys of youth. The chairs seemed to remember too. They held the weight of those who had sat in them decades earlier. They kept the shape of old evenings, of laughter now silent, of conversations long ended but never forgotten. A chair could not speak, yet it carried stories in the quiet way of objects that have been faithful for so long they almost become part of the family. When sleep finally called the household to its softer rooms, the chairs were left in dim firelight. Their shadows stretched across the floor like companions at rest. The fire would sink into glowing coals, sometimes sending up a single last spark before sleep claimed it as well. And the chairs, though inanimate, seemed to rest, too, until morning returned. And with it, the slow, steady rhythm of another day. In this way, generation after generation passed, not with great events or loud changes, but with the gentle heartbeat of home. Chairs near a hearth, fire whispering softly, life unfolding in small, tender gestures. Each evening a quiet ceremony of belonging. There were homes where the same armchairs stood in place for decades, perhaps even longer. They were moved only when floors were swept, or when seasons shifted and sunlight needed to be balanced differently in the room. But mostly, they remained. They became landmarks inside the house, not only furniture, but fixed points where life quietly revolved. In the first winters, they were new. The wood carried a faint scent of fresh carving, the cushions firm, the cloth uncreased. Families sat carefully at first, feeling both pride and care for their new seats. Children were warned not to jump or climb on them, and visitors were often offered a seat with a quiet gesture, a hand indicating comfort, respect, welcome. The chairs witnessed greetings, farewells, laughter, small arguments, confessions whispered in low voices, and long silences that said more than words ever could. Years softened everything. The wood lost its sharp edges, becoming rounder under the natural polish of hands and time. Cushions remembered bodies, leaning just so when a familiar weight returned. Threads loosened, colors grew mild, but instead of looking tired, they began to look right, as though they had found their true faces. Worn not by neglect, but by belonging. Some evenings, someone would sit alone in one of these chairs, a blanket pulled close, eyes wandering across the soft flicker of the hearth. Thoughts might drift like slow leaves on a quiet river, to people who once sat there. Two voices no longer in the house, two stories once told with wide eyes and soft laughter. A chair could hold such memories without effort, a silent keeper of continuity, proof that even as the world outside changed, here in this small, glowing space, something remained steady. There were seasons of celebration too, birthdays, harvests, safe returns from distant journeys. In those moments, the chairs were no longer just quiet witnesses. They were part of the circle. People leaned forward in them, raised cups, clapped hands, let their heads fall back in laughter that filled the room and rattled the windows. The fire burned brighter on such nights, feeding on joy as if it too were alive. The chairs absorbed all of it, the sound, the weight, the life, and held it as gently as they held silence. Sometimes a storm would shake the walls, rain slicing against shutters, wind humming through every crack it could find. Those nights, families drew closer to the fire, to one another. The chairs became anchors, each person settled, shoulders tucked in, blankets wrapped tight, the rhythm of breathing steadying against the roar outside. Children would press close to parents, parents to each other, and in that cluster of warmth and safety, the house felt like a single living thing, holding everyone inside it with quiet determination. And then there were the slow days of age. A grandparent, once strong and busy, now moved carefully, step by measured step, lowering themselves gently into the chair that had been theirs for years. It welcomed them without complaint, carrying weight that had changed, bones that ached, eyes that still saw every detail of the familiar room. They would sit long, sometimes without a word, simply listening. The crackle of logs, the distant chatter of others in another room, the steady beat of a clock, the soft hum of life going on. Occasionally, a child would climb up onto a lap, bringing with them the lightness of youth, the scent of grass or outside air, the curiosity of someone just beginning to know the world. Stories would spill then, not grand tales but small, human ones, about planting trees, about walking by rivers, about winters so cold the water turned to glass overnight. The child would listen, eyes wide, head resting against a chest that rose and fell in calm rhythm, firelight painting the room in liquid gold. And just like that, another layer of memory would weave itself into the quiet heart of the house. In every season, in every cycle, these armchairs were more than places to sit. They were quiet bridges between generations, between moments, between the hush of night and the hum of day. They absorbed the weight of joys and sorrows alike, and returned. Always the same offering: stillness, warmth, a place to rest. And when eventually, the house itself changed, when people left, when walls were repainted, when life's river carried families into new towns, new houses, new firesides, sometimes the chairs went with them, carried carefully, loaded with quiet care, as though moving not just wood and fabric, but something deeper, the invisible threads of home. They would be placed in new rooms, in front of new hearths, where new voices would rise. New laughter would fill the air, new footsteps would echo on floors never walked before. But to the chair, it was all one story. It had held the past and would hold the future. It would listen again, cradle again, warm again. It would sit through nights of celebration, of worry, of quiet reflection. It would be there when no words were needed, when simply sitting together was enough. And in some quiet hour, far into another night, someone would lean back, close their eyes, feel the soft give of the chair beneath them, and think, not in words, but in a slow, calm warmth that filled the chest, that life, in all its vast turning, sometimes feels most perfect in the smallest places: a chair, a fire, the hush of a house at peace. In the earliest days, coffee was not yet a daily promise. It was a curiosity, a quiet guest carried into ports on ships, that also brought tools, fabrics, letters, and hopes. Its scent, even before its taste, marked it as something from elsewhere, earthy, a little smoky deep, like soil after rain, but somehow alive with warmth. People approached it carefully, not with fear, but with that soft respect reserved for anything new, anything not yet understood but already felt. Mugs were simple then. They were not designed for coffee alone. They were wooden cups, sometimes carved with plain lines, thick pottery vessels, cool even when filled with something warm. Pieces borrowed from the rhythm of the kitchen, where nothing was made for display but everything was made to last. A mug might carry broth 1 hour, cider the next, coffee only occasionally. It was never just a container. It was part of the hand's memory of daily life, a weight, a shape, a quiet friend in the routines of morning and evening. When coffee was poured into these vessels, steam rose in lazy spirals, softening the air around the drinker. The first sip was not fast. It was cautious, almost meditative. The bitterness pressed against the tongue, unfamiliar yet intriguing. It was a taste that seemed to open the mind's shutters a little wider. Not a sharp jolt, but a steady lifting of the fog between night and day. People noticed that warmth reached not only the stomach but the spirit. It seemed to say, "You are awake now," but gently, kindly. At first, coffee was not a social ritual. It was a pause. Someone in the kitchen before dawn, waiting for bread to rise, might hold a mug in both hands, breathing in the warmth before tasting it. A craftsman at the end of a long day might sip in silence while tools cooled in their places, the workshop filling with evening quiet. A traveler might be offered a mug at a roadside home, the gesture wordless but generous. A seat by the fire, a warm drink, a sign that even a stranger belonged somewhere for a while. Slowly, it became more than a pause. It became a reason to linger. Families began to gather not only for meals but for these small moments of shared quiet. A father might pour 2 mugs, one for himself, one for a neighbor who had stopped by not for news, not for business, but simply for company. They would sit, shoulders angled toward the same window, watching the light settle on fields or rooftops. talking not in urgency but in the soft way of people who enjoy the sound of voices as much as their meaning. The mugs themselves changed, though never suddenly. Potters began to notice that a slightly wider base made a mug steadier near the hearth. A thicker rim kept heat a little longer. Handles were reshaped to fit more comfortably into fingers stiff from work or weather. And soon, color found its way onto them. Quiet blues, soft greens, gentle patterns of flowers or vines. They were not luxuries. They were companions, small pieces of beauty in rooms where days were long, winters heavy, summers full of work. Conversations around coffee grew gentle roots. They were never rushed. The drink asked for no performance. It offered, instead, time to talk, to rest, to think. Two mugs placed side by side on a table were sometimes all a friendship needed. The words above them might wander from weather to work, to wonder, with no need for grand declarations. The warmth in the cup seemed to warm the air between people too. By candlelight, coffee took on another softness. Evening mugs, brewed after a meal, did not exist to wake, but to hold. The dim glow of flame caught the rising steam like a small private mist. Shadows on walls moved slowly, as if listening. Someone would cradle a mug, fingers curved into the warmth. Eyes resting not on the drink, but on the room itself, the people in it, the quiet breathing of a house at ease. There were moments when coffee became memory. A child might watch an elder take slow sips, their hands steady despite age, their face calm, their words careful, every gesture carrying decades of habit. That child would grow, and in some other time, in some other kitchen, hold a mug the same way, not thinking about it, just doing what felt right, what felt like home. And so, coffee, without announcement, without ceremony, became part of America's small, beating heart. It did not arrive in loud halls or busy marketplaces. It arrived in hands, in warmth, in the quiet exchange of something dark and simple that carried with it a sense of pause, of presence, of belonging. It was not about hunger, nor thirst alone, nor even about energy. It was about being with life for a few moments, awake, still, and quietly content. There came a time when coffee no longer stayed in quiet corners. It began to move from kitchen shelves into parlors, from solitary cups into gatherings where more than warmth was shared, in towns that were still young, where streets were more dust than stone, and evenings fell like soft blankets over lamps that flickered in gentle yellow. Coffee began to whisper a new rhythm into daily life. Houses were simple, their rooms modest, but a mug of coffee had a way of making space feel fuller. A visitor would step in, brush off rain or snow, and the first words often needed no sound, only the sight of steam rising from a mug, offered with a quiet gesture that said, "You are welcome here. Sit, stay a while." It was never rushed, it never had to be. The drink did what words could not. It softened edges, slowed breaths, pulled moments out of the fast tide of days, and let them drift like leaves in calm water. Families discovered a new comfort in these gatherings, where once evenings meant only the end of work and the quiet of rest. Now there were conversations carried on soft currents of coffee's warmth. Chairs were pulled closer, tables carried not just bread and stew but mugs that seemed to invite gentle stories, tales of small victories, of weather and crops, of neighbors and distant kin. Nothing urgent, nothing loud, just the quiet, steady sound of people existing together. Coffee houses, too, began to emerge, not grand, not polished like the great cafes of Europe, but humble rooms with wooden benches, uneven floors, and walls that smelled faintly of roasted beans and rain-soaked coats. They were places not of spectacle, but of presence. Someone might come in not for company, but to read a paper, to listen, to think while surrounded by the slow hum of other lives. Another might arrive to meet a friend, and together they would sit for hours, speaking softly, letting time slip away unnoticed, except by the slow cooling of what was once hot in their hands. And in those rooms, something delicate happened. Ideas began to take root, not in the loud call of public squares, but in the shared murmurs of quiet spaces. Thoughts moved gently from one person to another, not as demands, but as offerings, like passing a mug across a table. Perhaps it was the drink's warmth, or its steadying effect, or simply the way it gave people a reason to stay in one place long enough to truly speak. But conversations turned into plans. Plans became quiet shifts in how people saw their world. The rise of coffee culture was not only about taste, it was about time, borrowed, stretched, softened. In homes, coffee began to shape mornings. A mug waiting at a table was no longer an occasional pleasure. It was a promise. The smell of brewing coffee moved through hallways, like a kind voice waking the day. It stirred not only those who drank it, but those who loved the sound of others gathering. The simple chorus of chairs scraping gently against wooden floors, of spoons touching ceramic, of sighs both tired and grateful at the start of work yet to come. By afternoon, it held another meaning. In some homes, coffee became the gentle interruption, a signal that work could pause, that hands could rest, that there was still warmth to be shared in the middle of an ordinary day. A mother might pour 2 mugs, one for herself, one for an older child taking a rare moment between tasks. They might sit by a window, watching rain blur the edge of fences, speaking not of important things but of quiet ones. The cat sleeping near the fire, the smell of bread, a neighbor's child learning to walk. And in that soft exchange, the coffee was almost invisible. Just a steady warmth beneath words that mattered only because they were shared. Evenings deepened its role further. When lamps were lit and the sound of the outside world fell away, coffee often found its way back to the table. Not as a need for wakefulness, but as a gentle companion to reflection. The day's work done, the night's rest not yet claimed. There was a space, fragile, precious, where people could simply be. Coffee did not fill the silence, it respected it. It sat quietly, cooling a little, waiting in case thoughts wished to be spoken aloud, in case laughter wished to return softly into a room at peace. What began as a foreign drink became, slowly, an emotional thread through daily life, woven into mornings, afternoons, evenings, into visits and farewells, into reading, planning, remembering. Not an event, not a luxury, but a quiet presence, as if America itself, still finding its balance, had discovered in coffee not a taste alone, but a way to breathe together. By the turn of each season, coffee settled more deeply into American homes. It was not a sudden shift, not a wave that rushed through streets and doors, but a quiet tide, steady, unhurried, patient as early dawn. What began as a drink for travelers, merchants, and the curious, soon became something so ordinary, it slipped beneath notice, a sign not of novelty, but of belonging. Imagine a farmhouse standing alone at the edge of a broad, open field. Morning light touches its windows gently. Inside, a small fire hums low, just enough to warm the room without breaking its stillness. On a wooden table, a mug waits, dark liquid sending up soft curls of steam. The sound of a chair sliding back, the quiet thud of boots on floorboards, the sigh of someone sitting down, letting their shoulders drop, as if at last the day can begin at a human pace. The first sip is not a command to wake, it is an invitation to notice. Notice the way the morning feels on the skin, the way distant birds are stirring, the way life begins, not with urgency, but with breath. In small towns, coffee became a quiet witness to thousands of lives touching briefly. A shopkeeper with a steaming mug at the counter, a traveler arriving dusty and weary, their eyes softening at the sight of a seat and warmth. A few coins change hands. Words are exchanged, but often not many. Sometimes a nod was enough, a silent acknowledgement that in this small corner of the world, no one stood entirely alone. It wove itself into moments between people who never planned to meet. 2 strangers sitting at opposite tables in a dim room, both nursing mugs, both lost in thought, both comforted, though they might not have known by what. Perhaps it was the soft sound of cups returning gently to wood, or the murmur of a conversation carried just out of earshot, or the faint sweetness that lingered at the edge of the tongue. At home, coffee became not just a drink, but a gentle punctuation mark through the day's sentences. After breakfast, before the next round of chores, a brief pause with a cup. Later, while waiting for bread to rise, another, not indulgence, rhythm. The cup as a companion, not in the way music fills a room, but the way a window lets in light, not demanding, simply present. Even gatherings that held weight, decisions about land, about families, about uncertain futures often began not with declarations but with coffee poured quietly, mugs placed gently onto a table, steam rising between thoughtful faces, the drink offering no answers, only the gift of shared stillness in which answers could appear on their own. In this way, coffee became not just a beverage, but a silent partner to life's unfolding, a witness to both the weight and lightness of being human. And in its rise, other rituals shifted. Tea, once the drink of civility, began to share its space. Meals adjusted slightly. Mornings gained a new fragrance. Some households placed beans in small tins. Others stored grounds in jars with lids that gave a soft pop when opened, releasing a smell that carried with it the memory of mornings past and the quiet hope of mornings yet to come. It was not about caffeine, not really. Not in these slow hours when no train demanded haste, no city bell demanded movement. It was about warmth held in hands, about moments framed gently instead of rushed past, about an ordinary thing carrying within it the quiet dignity of care. Someone roasted those beans, someone ground them, someone boiled water, someone poured, someone placed a cup before another. It was a chain of small human acts that together said, "You matter enough for this pause." Outside, towns grew, streets lengthened, shop signs multiplied, clocks began to hold stronger sway over the day. But even as life shifted toward measured hours, there remained those small, unmeasured pockets, early morning kitchens, late-night tables, rain-touched porches where coffee kept time, not with clocks, but with presence. The drink did not change much in taste. It did not need to. What changed was what people found in it, a softness in the hard edges of work, a tether in the drifting of thoughts, a gentle ceremony hidden inside an ordinary act. And so coffee became not merely consumed but experienced, slowly, quietly, again and again, until it no longer felt new at all. It felt like home. As decades turned gently over one another, coffee moved from household to household, no longer a curiosity, but a quiet companion to the rhythm of American days. It followed no single path, rather it seeped through towns like water through soil, filling spaces without flooding them, touching lives not with drama but with calm familiarity. In villages near the coast, where the wind carried salt and the gulls cried in distant arcs above, morning coffee meant warmth against a brisk breeze. Families gathered near hearths, hands wrapped around thick ceramic mugs, steam mingling with the faint smell of burning wood. The drink didn't shout its importance, it simply existed, waiting, offering comfort as naturally as a blanket draped over tired shoulders. Further inland, where wide plains stretched beneath skies that seemed to go on forever, coffee served another role. It bridged the vast quiet of early morning with the long labor of fields and workshops. Before tools were lifted, before doors opened to trade or to toil, there was the gentle pause of coffee. Spoons tapped against ceramic, chairs creaked under shifting weight. Eyes slowly focused, not on distant plans, but on the simple here and now. Towns began to shape themselves around new habits. Cafes emerged, not as bustling centers, but as soft corners of human company. Wooden counters bore the weight of cups and conversation alike. Windows fogged lightly from the warmth within, framing blurred glimpses of passing streets. There, friends met not for business, but for being together, for the quiet kind of company where words were optional, where the presence of another human being, breathing in the same warm air, was enough. In some places, the scent of coffee would drift into alleyways, beckoning travelers like a soft bell. A weary rider might step down from his horse, brush dust from his coat, and walk toward that smell, not in hunger, but in hope of a momentary reprieve. A simple cup, a nod from a stranger, a seat by a window watching rain streak against glass. These were not grand events, but they were the fabric from which ordinary days were stitched. In parlors of modest homes, coffee became a gesture of welcome. Guests were not offered it with flourish, but with quiet sincerity, as though saying, "Here, let this cup tell you that you are safe, that you are not intruding, that time itself is willing to slow while you sit." The conversation might drift over weather, over crops, over the sound of a neighbor's new clock ticking faintly through thin walls. No subject urgent, no voice raised, only the slow hum of people alive in the same moment. Somewhere along the way, Coffee became memory. A father's steady hands pouring into chipped mugs on cold mornings. A mother setting out a second cup beside her own, long before a neighbor knocked, knowing they would stop by. A friend passing through town, staying just long enough to share one quiet morning and a story neither of them would later recall in full. Only the warmth of that morning together, preserved in the mind like the faint echo of a bell at dusk. Even as cities grew tall and the pace of life sharpened, coffee carried with it the gentle echo of slower times. In train stations, hurried travelers paused for a sip. In offices, cups cooled on desks between letters and ledgers. In kitchens above busy streets, someone stirred sugar into a mug, while traffic murmured below, a private moment amid the motion of the world. It never demanded to be noticed. That was its gift. It could hold joy without fanfare, sorrow without weight, ordinary hours without emptiness. The same cup that steadied hands during storms could cradle laughter on a sunlit porch. The drink itself did not change, the hearts holding it did, from young to old, from restless to at peace, from seeking to simply being. And so, by the time coffee had fully claimed its quiet space in American life, it was no longer spoken of with novelty, no longer traced to foreign shores or distant markets. It was simply there, woven into the fabric of waking hours, folded gently into the rituals of families, workplaces, friendships, and solitary thoughts. Late at night, after candles burned low and clocks ticked softly in corners, a lone figure might pour a final cup, leaning against a wooden table, listening to the creak of the house settling in the cool dark. There was no ceremony left in it, no performance, just warmth, breath, and the simple peace of a small thing done with care. And in that, perhaps, coffee told its truest story, not as a marker of progress or a symbol of change, but as a witness to human quietude, a thread running invisibly through countless lives, holding nothing but the shape of togetherness, of pauses taken, of moments lived not in haste but in stillness. A gentle warmth carried forward, cup by cup, across years, across miles, across the unremarkable yet precious span of ordinary days. There was a time when the marking of hours was not a loud announcement, not a chime echoing through towers or a mechanical bell in busy factories, but a gentle presence, quiet and steady, keeping pace with the world while rarely drawing attention. In small American homes, wall clocks were not just devices, they were companions, quiet, patient, and constant. Hanging often in the center of a home, they blended into the surroundings, yet anchored the space in an invisible rhythm. A wooden frame polished by countless years of light and dust. A face that held numbers like soft whispers of order. Hands that moved with perfect calm. They were not made to hurry anyone, nor to alarm. They existed to remind the house that time was passing, but not to demand that it be chased. In the early hours of the day, when pale light slipped through curtains and families stirred from sleep, the ticking would be there, not as a sound to wake to, but as part of the atmosphere. While bread baked, while water boiled, while the quiet shuffle of morning life unfolded, the clock kept its gentle beat, steady, neutral, endlessly patient. It did not speak of urgency, it only marked what had passed, second by second, a small heartbeat in wood and brass. Children grew up with that sound like a kind of reassurance. In the midst of play, of chores, of quiet reading, the soft, even rhythm of the clock on the wall told them, without words, that the day was moving forward, that they were safe in the gentle march of hours. When storms rattled windows and winds pushed branches against the siding of a house, the ticking stayed even, a small proof that inside, all was steady. Evenings carried their own quiet rituals. As lamps or candles were lit and chairs pulled closer to fires, the sound of the clock softened further into the background, blending with conversation, with the gentle hum of stories shared or the silent companionship of people comfortable in each other's company. Sometimes the pendulum could be seen swinging faintly, a gleam of brass in dim light, like the breathing of the house itself. When visitors came, they might glance at the clock, not only to know the hour, but as if to take in something about the home itself, its sense of calm, of trust in time's slow passage. The clock did not interrupt. It waited. It served not as a reminder of what must be done, but as a gentle measure of how much of the day had already been quietly lived. Over generations, clocks became heirlooms. They moved with families, were wrapped carefully in cloth when houses changed, hung again with care in new rooms where their sound began to settle once more into the bones of a home. Their ticking bridged not just minutes, but memories. A child who once fell asleep beneath its sound might decades later hear the same rhythm in a different house, carrying a subtle comfort like a melody half remembered. Sometimes, in quiet afternoons, when sunlight angled through windows and dust floated like slow falling snow, a person might pause, cup in hand, and simply listen. There, between breaths, the tick and talk stood out, not intrusive, but present, a reminder of life's most humble truth, that time moves always, and that it does so gently for those who allow it. The clocks were also storytellers of a quiet kind. If they could have spoken, they might have told of conversations overheard in kitchens, of arguments softened by later laughter, of tears shed beneath their steady count, of songs hummed while chores were done, of seasons arriving with no great announcement other than the change in light across their wooden faces. They bore witness not to history's grand turns, but to the soft arcs of ordinary human lives, the kind of lives that fill a nation, uncelebrated yet deeply real. Even in solitude, a wall clock offered a sense of companionship. Its steady rhythm could fill a quiet room where no voices rose, where only a chair, a book, and a low-burning lamp stood beside it. The ticking kept loneliness from feeling empty. It turned silence into presence, a reminder that life still moved around and through that quiet space. And when night came, when the lamps were extinguished and the house sank into stillness, the clock kept its vigil. Through the soft hum of crickets outside, through the occasional groan of settling timbers, its heartbeat did not falter. Time continued to pass, but not as something lost, rather, as something gently carried forward, like a river at night that cannot be seen but can be trusted to still be there come morning. In this way, the humble wall clock held more than hours. It held a rhythm for lives shaped not by haste but by simple, enduring presence. It was a comfort not because it stopped time, but because it proved that even in the quietest rooms, something was steady, something was sure, something was keeping watch. In every home that held a wall clock, there existed a subtle thread that tied together all the moments within it. You could not see this thread. It had no weight, no color, no shape. And yet it existed, a delicate strand of sound, a gentle tapping that crossed rooms, drifted up staircases, and filled hallways with the quiet assurance that time was moving as it always had, steady, without rush, without pause. In kitchens, where meals were prepared in the soft company of simmering pots, the ticking clock became a kind of companion to the soft bubbling of soup, or the faint crackle of bread toasting near the fire, while knives sliced through vegetables and flowers scattered across wooden boards. The steady tick-tock in the corner reminded cooks not of schedules or deadlines, but simply of the hours gentle unfolding. Morning, noon, and night, each carried in the same soft measure. Children, too, came to know the clock's rhythm long before they knew its purpose. They would hear it as they played quietly on wooden floors, as they curled up with a blanket near a window, as they drifted toward sleep in the slow stretch of an afternoon. Some would ask, with that curiosity found only in the young, what made the sound? And a parent, smiling, would point to the swinging pendulum, describing it not with technical words, but with a soft truth. It keeps us company while the day moves forward. Even in moments of worry or sorrow, the wall clock held its calm. A family might gather in a sitting room, words spoken low, hands held tight, breaths coming in slow waves, and beneath it all, the clock continued, impartial yet comforting. Its ticking reminded those who listened that even when hearts felt heavy, the world did not collapse, time did not stop. Life, with all its unexpected turns, still carried itself forward, second by second, gently, patiently. When visitors entered, they often noticed the clock's sound before they noticed its face. A faint, steady rhythm in the background, sometimes sharp in its click, sometimes soft, like a whisper tucked behind wooden doors. It served as a host that did not greet with words but with presence, letting strangers and friends alike know that this was a home in motion, alive not with noise but with continuity. In the quiet of night, when the house sank into the depth of silence, the clock's sound became almost a lullaby. Children, lying awake beneath blankets, might follow the rhythm until their minds grew still, their eyelids heavy. Adults, alone with their thoughts, found the soft pattern soothing, a reminder that even in solitude, there was movement, there was company, there was something steady beside them. Through seasons, the clock offered its patient voice. In winter, when winds howled outside and snow pressed against windows, the ticking was a soft warmth, a reassurance that not all things in the world were wild or cold. In spring, when rain pattered gently on rooftops, the clock joined in like a polite percussion, a heartbeat beneath nature's soft song. Summer brought long daylight hours and quiet evenings when windows were open, and still the clock kept its patient rhythm, unfazed by the hum of insects or the distant laughter of neighbors. Autumn came with dry leaves brushing across porches, with cool air slipping into rooms, and the clock ticked on, a small anchor in the slow change of the world. Sometimes, when the house grew empty, when children left for schools in distant towns, when friends moved away, when elders passed and left rooms silent, the clock remained. It did not grieve, yet it held memory in its constancy. Those who returned after long absences often found themselves pausing by it, listening and feeling, deep in the chest, the subtle ache of familiarity, the way a sound can carry not just time, but everything that once filled that time. Clocks were not only practical, they were symbolic in their quiet way. They reminded households that days were not infinite, but neither were they fleeting when lived gently. They gave shape to mornings, middays, and nights, not as walls or fences, but as soft markers, gentle nods from the passing hours that life, though moving, could be savored, could be felt, could be deeply present in its smallest moments. And in that stillness, in that faint rhythm, floating through the air like a second heartbeat for the house, people found comfort. They didn't need to look at it to feel its effect. They didn't need to speak of it to appreciate its quiet companionship. They simply lived alongside it, letting the sound of moving hands on a humble wooden vase guide them not forward or backward, but gently deeper into the ordinary, into the calm that sits patiently at the heart of every home. Beyond the walls of family homes, the quiet patience of a clock could be found in nearly every small town building. It hung in general stores above counters stacked with jars of sugar and tea, above barrels of nails and rope, marking the gentle passing of commerce without urgency. Shopkeepers glanced at it, not to chase a schedule, but to feel where they stood within the flow of the day. The ticking, steady and impartial, belonged to everyone who stepped inside, a shared reminder that the world was turning, slowly, predictably, kindly. In schools, wall clocks kept company with young minds and restless hands. Children sat at wooden desks, pencils scratching faint lines across pages, while above them, a pendulum swung like a steady metronome for thoughts, lessons, and daydreams alike. Teachers, glancing upward between sentences, found both structure and comfort there. No bell needed to shout. The soft certainty of the clock was enough to guide the day forward, lesson to lesson, until at last its steady rhythm carried students into the quiet stretch of afternoon. Books tucked under arms, their small feet following paths homeward. Even in churches, where silence carried a different weight, where prayer bent the air and voices rose in low, thoughtful murmurs, a clock sometimes hung quietly on a side wall, a humble servant of time among sacred words. It did not intrude, nor did it demand attention. Its tick and talk lived softly in the background, reminding even the most reverent that the hours moved gently onward, that time and faith could sit beside each other without conflict, both steady, both infinite in their own quiet ways. In waiting rooms, clocks carried a slightly different role. There their sound became a kind of anchor for those in the in-between, people sitting with papers folded in laps, coats draped over chairs, eyes wandering without focus. The ticking marked something safe, something ordinary, when uncertainty pressed in. While thoughts drifted, the rhythm stayed the same. It whispered, in its small way, "You are still here. The world is still moving. This moment too will pass." In cafes, diners, and small-town restaurants, clocks often blended into the decor so thoroughly that few noticed them at all. Yet their effect was felt. Breakfast crowds ebbed and flowed with the quiet guidance of their hands. Noon came not with a trumpet, but with the soft certainty of numbers shifting upward, while conversations carried on in the easy cadence of people unhurried by exact minutes. A traveler might glance up, mid-bite, catch the time, and carry it with them like a soft reassurance rather than a command. Even in offices, the modest ones, with papers stacked neatly and windows that overlooked slow streets, a wall clock offered the same calm consistency. While letters were written, sums were tallied, while pens were dipped and signatures dried. The steady beat marked the hours like footsteps in another room. It neither hurried nor lingered. It kept company with thought, providing structure without intrusion, a background rhythm for the mind's quieter labors. Factories, too, came to know clocks, though there the sound could be drowned in the hum of machinery, the hiss of steam, the sharp clang of tools meeting metal. Yet still, somewhere on a wall, the hands turned. Someone, at some point in every shift, looked to it for a small sense of orientation, to know how far they had come, how far they had yet to go. It was not an overseer. It was a witness, turning its face through noise, heat, and motion, steady in a world that pulsed with work. In public libraries, the clock's voice merged with pages turning, with the faint shuffle of shoes along wooden floors. Their time moved differently, stretched, softened, slowed. The tick of a wall clock in such a place seemed almost like a reminder that even silence belonged to the world of minutes and hours. That even the deepest absorption in a story or a study lived within time's quiet river. And in all these places, the homes, the schools, the shops, the churches, the offices, the factories, the quiet cafes, the wall clock did not claim importance. It did not boast or cry out. It did not seek credit for holding lives together in their unremarkable, beautiful routine. It simply was. A modest presence, a keeper of hours, a gentle heartbeat for spaces both humble and grand. It gave shape to days without demanding shape from the people living them. It reminded, without scolding, that time is neither a tyrant nor a thief when welcomed as a companion. Perhaps this is why, even as the world modernized, as electric signals replaced gears and glowing screens replaced pendulums, the humble wall clock held on in hearts and homes, not for necessity, not even always for use, but for the feeling of it, for the steady, calming assurance that some rhythms do not need improvement, that some sounds belong not to progress but to presence, that some small ticking circles of brass and wood still carry within them the essence of a life gently, beautifully, ordinarily lived. Evening would gather gently, the way dusk always did, without ceremony, without rush. Windows glowed softly as light faded from the sky, and in kitchens across towns and quiet stretches of countryside, the clocks were already at work, not as rulers of the hour but as companions to it. The steady beat of their ticking moved like a calm voice in a calm house, neither hurried nor hesitant. It told no one what to do. It simply let them know where they were, gently marking the passing of a day grown older, ready now to fold itself into night. In dining rooms, a clock might hang above a table set for supper, a plain wooden circle, polished smooth by time, its hands inching forward as meals were served. Conversations rose and softened, laughter trailed off like ribbons of sound, disappearing into the evening. The clink of utensils and the low hum of voices blended with that quiet rhythm, until the clock was no longer a thing noticed, but simply part of the room's breathing, the heartbeat of a home that trusted its own stillness. Upstairs, in bedrooms lit by lamplight, where quilts were drawn close and windows let in a small taste of night air, clocks on the wall kept their patient beat. Children, their eyelids heavy, often found comfort in that sound, not consciously, not as a thing to listen for, but as a gentle presence that seemed to say, "You are safe, the world is steady. Time is here, and it is kind tonight." Even adults, lying awake in quiet moments, sometimes caught the faint click of a clock in the hall and felt less alone, as though someone else were awake with them, counting the same seconds softly, without judgment, without end. In parlors, where chairs gathered near a fire, where friends or family sat in quiet companionship, where sometimes no words at all were needed, the wall clock watched over the moment. Its face, pale in the low glow of the flames, moved its hands one small step at a time, like a patient walker strolling through the hours. Those who sat beneath it might have felt, even without thinking, that time in that space had a different shape, not a line pulling them forward, but a circle gently turning, carrying them along like a slow dance. No one had to lead. Sometimes a clock ticked in an otherwise silent house. Perhaps someone had gone away, perhaps no one lived there any longer, or not for a while. Yet the clock kept going. Its sound filled empty rooms, not with sadness, but with a quiet dignity, as though it were keeping watch, guarding the hollow spaces until laughter and footsteps returned. That rhythm was the same, whether heard or ignored, whether shared or alone. It was a promise, made in small metallic whispers, that life's pace did not depend on company, but on the simple, steady flow of time itself. In certain homes, clocks were cherished heirlooms. Their wooden cases bore faint scratches from moves across states, across decades, perhaps even across centuries. Their faces yellowed slightly, their pendulums worn smooth by 1,000 gentle arcs. Yet still they kept time, sometimes imperfectly, sometimes stubbornly, but with a loyalty that outlived even the people who once wound them each night. They carried not only hours, but memories of kitchens warm with bread, of winters spent in rocking chairs, of letters written and read beneath their quiet ticking watch. And when the world outside grew louder, when machines roared, when engines whirred, when new devices began to measure time invisibly, silently, with perfect precision, still there were those who preferred the sound of a clock, not because it was necessary, but because it felt human. It felt alive in a way that screens and signals never quite could. Each tick, each talk, was like a small bow of respect to the very idea of time as a companion rather than a command. In the stillness of night, when the house had gone completely quiet, when even the faintest voices of day had drifted away, the sound of a wall clock could feel like a soft reassurance in the dark. It did not light the room, it did not warm it, yet it reminded anyone who listened, even if half asleep, that the night was not endless, that hours were quietly arranging themselves, like careful caretakers, so that morning would return right on time, not forced, not summoned, simply allowed to arrive, as it always had. Perhaps this is why the gentle ticking of a wall clock is remembered so fondly by those who have lived beside it, not for its precision, though some prided themselves on it, not for its beauty, though many were crafted with care, but for the calm it brought, the quiet reminder that life need not rush, that hours pass, whether chased or welcomed, and that in a home filled with soft voices, dim lamps, and slow breaths, time could be felt not as something taken, but as something kindly given. And so, in houses across the country, from crowded towns to quiet farmhouses, from tall city apartments to small clapboard cottages, a simple clock hung on the wall. It was not the center of attention, not a treasure locked away, but a humble companion to the passing days. It ticked through meals, through silences, through laughter, through tears, through sleep. It marked no great victories, announced no grand events. It simply bore witness, gently, steadily, to the rhythm of lives well and quietly lived. Night descended the way a blanket settles over a child, slow, deliberate, with a patience that seemed almost affectionate. Outside, the wind moved gently between trees, not restless, not wild, simply passing, like a friend on a late errand. Inside a small home, far from the noise of the streets, the lamps were dim. A few candles had been lit, their flames thin yet strong, casting pools of gold across wooden tables, soft fabric chairs, and the familiar curve of everyday things now bathed in a quieter beauty. The air held a mild sweetness, the faint lingering of supper, the light temps of cooling tea, the dry warmth of wood touched by fire earlier in the evening. Shadows stretched softly along the walls, not sharp or menacing but soft and rounded, the kind that move only when a breeze slips through a loose frame or a sleeper turns in their chair. Everything in the room seemed to exhale at once. The chairs, the curtains, even the polished wood of the clock against the far wall, as though the whole space had been holding a deep breath all day, and now it could finally let it go. In the center of the room sat a low table, scattered with objects that felt like companions rather than possessions. A folded quilt, a half-finished letter, a book whose page had been left waiting, trusting the reader to return. A cup with the faint ring of steam still rising from what had once been warm coffee. These were not treasures by any strict measure, yet each carried a quiet significance, like footprints left by the soft, unnoticed moments of a day lived without urgency. On the far wall, the clock continued its slow, patient work. Its pendulum swung like the steady breathing of someone asleep nearby, the soft talk like a heartbeat heard through a pillow. It was not there to remind anyone of time's demands, but to keep time company, to say, in its own small way, I am here. I will keep track. You may rest now. The sound slipped into the background so gently that, after a few minutes, it was no longer heard as sound at all, but felt as presence, like a warm hand resting quietly near your own. The candles flickered. Each one had its own subtle rhythm, as if no two flames ever agreed on how to dance in the same way. They leaned slightly when the room shifted with air, then straightened with a pride that seemed almost human. Their glow softened the faces of anyone who passed nearby, a cheek catching gold, an eyelid made warm, a smile becoming not merely visible but deeply tender. Under that light, everything felt less separate. The objects, the people, the air itself, all part of one shared, breathing quiet. Somewhere, perhaps upstairs, a child stirred in their sleep. The floorboards gave a low sigh, the kind old wood makes after holding generations of steps. A door clicked softly, not closed nor opened with intention, just moved by the subtle pressure of the house settling into night. Every sound seemed slower here, as if the very concept of speed had been excused from the room until morning. Even thought itself moved gently, turning not to worries or tasks, but to gratitude, small, wordless, calm. A chair near the window invited someone to sit. Its fabric was worn smooth in places where hands had rested for years. Its cushions shaped to a body that had come home tired again and again. From there, the night outside could be seen not as a darkness to endure, but as a living painting, a stretch of sky neither black nor blue, but something in between, with faint stars testing their glow above rooftops asleep. A breeze touched the glass and carried with it a quiet that wasn't empty but full of peace, of space, of a kind of safety that needed no announcement. The clock, now and then, gave a fuller sound, a soft chime, almost shy, marking not the hour as a command but as a gentle acknowledgement. Time had passed, and nothing had been lost. A moment had become a memory without any need to be held tightly, because the evening itself was the keeper of all things gentle. Each tick was like the turning of a page in a story no one was rushing to finish. It was in such moments that homes revealed their true gift, not in their walls or their roofs, but in their ability to hold stillness without making it feel like emptiness. A house at night, lit by candles, kept awake by a clock, offered something rare, a space where the day's noise, its errands, its endless lists, simply dissolved. What remained was a quiet companionship. You, the steady beat of time, the warm breath of light, the soft murmur of a world allowed to rest. And as night deepened, the home seemed to lean into the rhythm of sleep. Not sudden, not complete, but gradual, like a tide easing away from the shore. One by one, candles would be pinched out, their smoke curling upward in threads that faded into the dark. But for now, a few still burned. Their light made a promise in silence. This night, like all the nights before, would hold the hours gently, and deliver the morning without haste, without trouble, exactly as it had always done. The evening deepened the way a slow river sinks into its own quiet. Shadows outside no longer stretched, they had settled, soft and still, along the edges of fences and rooftops. The air had turned cooler, yet not cold. It moved through the cracks of windows like a gentle whisper that carried no news, no warning, only calm. Inside the home, the candles continued their patient vigil. Their light did not brighten the room so much as cradle it. Pools of gold that made every corner feel less like a space and more like a memory of safety. On the small wooden table, the objects of the day now rested as if asleep. A cup sat empty, a faint ring left at its base, like the ghost of warmth gone only moments ago. A pair of glasses folded neatly beside a book, the page left waiting, mid-thought, mid-sentence, trusting the night to keep its place until morning. Even the chairs, arranged without ceremony, seemed to lean toward each other, like quiet companions keeping watch. The clock on the far wall swung its pendulum with unshaken loyalty. Its voice, a soft, even tick, counted not the hours left or lost, but simply the presence of time as something kind, something safe, Each sound slipped into the room like a calm breath, the sort that makes you close your eyes, not from sleep, but from a gentle gratitude that asks for nothing and offers everything. Occasionally, a chime, soft, low, like a hush turned into music, reminded the house that the night was still moving, even if no one needed to follow. In another room, a quilt was pulled higher over someone's shoulder. A sigh, quiet and content, escaped into the dark, not in words but in a language the house understood. The language of rest, of trust, of the body telling the world, I am safe here. A few boards gave a faint creak, not from strain but from age, the way old wood sometimes speaks without meaning to. It was a kind of conversation between the present and all the nights before, a whisper that said this piece had been here long before and would remain long after. The wind outside brushed against the windows like a slow-moving hand, tracing invisible lines across the glass. It carried with it the softest echo of leaves moving somewhere down the lane, the gentle shuffle of branches letting go of their stillness for just a moment. There were no carriages, no footsteps, no distant calls, only the natural, unhurried murmurs of a world, allowed to be itself, unobserved and unbothered. By the hearth, now cool, sat two armchairs, angled slightly toward each other. They were empty, yet somehow not lonely. The fabric, worn smooth from years of use, carried the warmth of countless evenings like this one. Evenings when stories were told, tea was sipped, letters were read aloud. Tonight they held only silence, yet it was a silence shaped like comfort, the kind you don't fill because it already holds everything that needs to be said. The house itself seemed to be breathing. Each small sound, the faint shift of wood, the delicate sigh of the curtains as air passed through, the slow rhythm of the clock together became a heartbeat, a pulse not of a single life, but of a space designed to hold many lives gently. It was as if the walls remembered every laugh, every quiet tear, every whispered goodnight, and now offered them back in the form of a piece so complete it almost hummed. A cat perhaps belonging to the household, perhaps a wanderer who had found an open door and a soft rug, stirred slightly, stretched in the quiet, and resettled with the kind of trust only animals seem to carry without effort. Its slow breathing joined the clock's rhythm, turning sound into a kind of music, not one that could be played, but one that could be felt, like warmth against the skin. Up above, the sky held its stars without urgency. They were steady, like old friends watching from a distance, unconcerned with being noticed, simply content to be. The moon gave a faint glow over the street outside, enough to silver the edges of rooftops, and the faint shapes of trees, swaying like guardians in no hurry at all. The world beyond this home could have been wide, busy, and restless, but here, in this small, candlelit room, it was distilled into something human-sized, heart-sized, slow. No one spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because words would have been an interruption, like dropping a pebble into still water, only to watch the calm ripple away. Silence here was not emptiness, it was fullness, the kind that comes when every need has been quietly met, and nothing more is asked of the hour but to keep being exactly what it already is. Time kept moving, not in leaps, not in demands, but in a steady glide that made even the night feel like a deep breath held between yesterday and tomorrow. And the home, the candles, the clock, and the hearts within it all agreed, without ever saying a word. This is what safety feels like. The hour had passed beyond the part of night when most homes are awake. Streets outside no longer held even the occasional echo of a carriage or the muffled sound of late footsteps. What remained was a kind of wide, deep silence, not a silence that pressed or weighed, but one that spread like a soft blanket, tucking every corner of the small town into rest. Inside, the candles still burned, though lower now. Their wax had softened, leaning toward their bases, their light smaller but no less steady. The flames wavered gently, each movement a tiny dance of air that gave the room a sense of being alive even in its quietest state. The smell of wax mingled faintly with the old wood of the furniture, the faint iron temps of the clock's inner workings, and the warm, nearly invisible hint of wool from the blankets resting nearby. The clock, ever faithful, marked the passing of each moment without rush, without weight, simply a sound to remind anyone listening that time was still gently turning. Its pendulum, like the slow sway of a cradle, moved with a rhythm that soothed rather than counted. Sometimes it seemed that the clock was not there to keep time for the people in the room, but for the room itself, to keep the walls company, to keep the night steady. In a corner chair, a person sat, leaning slightly, not asleep, not fully awake, just settled into that rare state of being where nothing is required. A hand rested on the arm of the chair, fingers curled loosely as if they had simply forgotten to hold on to the day. The eyes were half closed, not in fatigue, but in a kind of quiet wonder, the way one might close their eyes while listening to a favorite piece of music, not to block the world out, but to feel it more deeply. Outside the window, the moon climbed a little higher, casting its pale wash across rooftops, fences, and the narrow curve of the street. Trees stood like silhouettes, tall and protective, as if guarding the sleeping homes they'd known for decades. The night carried no secrets tonight, no dramas or stories to interrupt the stillness. It was simply what it was, a stretch of time where the world took its softest breath. On the floor by the chair, a small rug caught the candlelight in uneven threads. A faint fray near the edge told of years of footsteps passing quietly over it, of countless evenings just like this one, where nothing extraordinary happened and yet everything felt perfectly complete. It was in these unnoticed, unremarkable nights that life seemed to hum most honestly, not in celebrations, not in crises, but in the moments where nothing demanded attention, and thus everything could simply be felt. The house creaked again, low and long, the way old wood does when it remembers the day's warmth against the cool pull of night. It was the kind of sound that made no one stir, because in homes like this, creaks were never warnings. They were simply the house shifting, stretching, sighing a body of beams and nails and memories, quietly settling deeper into its own comfort. The person in the chair leaned back slightly, letting the head rest against the wood. The chair gave a soft groan, a sound that carried more familiarity than inconvenience. From somewhere upstairs, a soft step, perhaps a child dreaming lightly, turning under their blanket, then quiet again, as though even the house had agreed that it was best to let the night remain unbroken. The candles dimmed a little more, each flame leaning gently, like tired eyes giving in to the inevitability of sleep. The clock gave another small chime, not a ringing, not a striking, but a soft announcement, like a kind voice saying, "It is later now. You may rest more deeply if you wish." The sound settled into the room like a stone in still water, rippling only calm. Somewhere, the faintest breath of outside air slipped in through a barely open window, carrying with it the smell of night, a cool, invisible blend of soil, distant trees, and the faint metallic taste of dew beginning to form. It brushed across the skin, not as a chill, but as a gentle reminder that the world continued, unhurried, unchanged. In this home, on this night, every element seemed to agree on one simple truth. Nothing more was needed, not more words, not more light, not more time. Everything essential was already present. Warmth, quiet, the slow certainty of the clock, the soft companionship of familiar walls, and the deep, soothing presence of night, doing exactly what it should do. Hold everything gently until morning, and in that balance, that quiet, perfect stillness, the mind, even without sleep, began to rest. Thoughts no longer moved in lines, no longer asked questions, no longer solved or planned. They drifted instead, like boats untied and allowed to float wherever the soft current took them. It was not an escape, but a return to the simplest state of being human. Here, alive, safe, quiet, at peace. The clock's pendulum continued its slow, steady journey. It was a rhythm that no longer seemed to belong to time at all, but to the night itself, a gentle movement, back and forth, like the sway of a hammock on a windless porch. Its soft click at each edge of the arc marked the quiet shape of passing hours. But here, in this home, time felt as if it had loosened its hold, letting the moments stretch into something softer, wider, more forgiving. The candles burned lower still, their flames small and golden, leaning toward their own reflections in the polished surface of a nearby table. Wax had pooled gently at their bases, no longer neat, but beautifully resigned, as though even the candles understood that their purpose was not to last forever, but simply to give light while it was needed. The smell of warm wax clung faintly to the air, mingling with the hush of cool night air drifting in through a slightly open window. A single chair sat angled toward the fireplace. Though no fire had been laid tonight, the chair carried the imprint of countless evenings, the subtle curve where a back had rested, the faint polish on the wood where hands had gripped, stood, and sat again. It was not the chair itself that held comfort, but the years of small, quiet lives that had passed through it, leaving behind a kind of invisible warmth that lingered even when the room was empty. On a shelf nearby, a row of books stood like silent witnesses, their spines dulled by touch, their edges softened by years of being opened under candlelight. They said nothing, but their presence alone suggested 100 evenings like this one, where stories and knowledge moved softly through rooms while night held the world still. Some books had belonged to those who were no longer here, yet the words inside remained untouched, waiting for eyes, any eyes, to trace them again when the house stirred once more. The walls, thick and worn, seemed almost to lean in, as though listening. Old houses did that sometimes. They remembered, not in the way people did, with details and names, but with a quiet familiarity, a sense of belonging to something larger than any single day. The grain of the wood, the plaster patched and repatched, the faint marks where furniture had been moved across seasons, all of it whispered gently into the silence. You have lived here, and it has mattered. Outside, the moon had begun its slow descent, carrying with it the silvery calm that only late-night hours seemed to hold. The world was neither asleep nor awake, but hovering in that space where dreams were nearest to the surface. The street beyond the window lay empty, shadows soft and long. A cat, somewhere far off, moved through a garden, its soft steps making no sound at all. Even the trees seemed to sleep. No branches stirred, no leaves rustled. The night was whole. A soft sigh rose from somewhere in the house, the kind that comes not from tiredness, but from the body settling even deeper into rest. The house creaked once, a slow, deep sound like an exhale, as though even wood and nail understood that the world had grown quiet enough to breathe. The clock answered with another slow tick, a conversation of old companions, each at ease with the other's company. The person in the chair perhaps still awake, perhaps only barely shifted slightly, a small movement that stirred neither purpose nor sound. It was simply the body finding a softer place to be. The eyes remained closed now, lids heavy, thoughts slowed. There were no plans for tomorrow, no echoes of the day, only the soft, rhythmic promise of night. Stay, rest, let go. One candle flickered, its flame stretching, then returning to shape, as though it too was tempted toward sleep. Its light reached gently across the room, catching on glass, on brass, on the smooth curve of a coffee mug resting forgotten on a small table. The mug held no warmth now, only the faint scent of what had once been took, and yet even that seemed perfect, a trace of comfort lingering quietly like the memory of a hand once held. The clock struck, not loudly, not sharply, but with the low, mellow sound of something practiced, something kind. It did not announce the hour as much as it sang it, soft and deep, like a lullaby made not of words but of timing, of presence. Each note dissolved into the night as though the walls themselves absorbed them, keeping the peace unbroken. At last, the smallest movements began, the gentle dimming of candles one by one, the slow settling of wax into stillness, a chair's faint creak as weight left it, the sound of footsteps unhurried, soft, as though even walking was something to be done with care. Upstairs, a door opening, then closing with the slightest of sounds, like the night tucking itself in. The room remained quiet still. The clock continued, loyal and calm. The air cooled further, carrying with it the first hint of morning, not yet visible, not yet near, but inevitable. And in that quiet, that perfect, unbroken quiet, the house, the night, and the heart inside it all seemed to breathe together, slow and deep, as though everything had at last remembered the same simple truth. Rest is not only for sleep. It is a way of being present, even in the dark, even in the soft turning of hours, even when no one is watching. The candles gave their final, gentle sigh, a soft curl of smoke rising into the cool air, and darkness, warm and complete, returned the house to its most natural state. No sound, no motion, just the tender hum of time passing, the steady presence of a clock keeping watch, and the vast, quiet comfort of knowing that all was well, exactly as it should be.